That is one big pile of shit.
Twentieth Century Fox, I don't even know what to say at this point. I really don't. I can't even get angry at this point like I do with other movies like Hellboy, or even worse superhero movies like Venom, Justice League, or Batman v Superman. However, the way I'm reacting to this right now, I can only describe by saying this. 20th Century Fox, I'm sad. I'm sad, I'm disappointed, but most of all, I'm insulted as an audience member, and I'm embarrassed at the fact that not only does this movie exist, but the fact that this movie ends an entire franchise while falling down a set of stairs in the process. This was supposed to be the franchise to right the wrongs of previous movies such as X-Men Last Stand, X-Men Origins Wolverine, and to cap off this franchise in a satisfying way since this is the final movie in the X-Men universe. But if you guys can't tell already based on my introduction, yes, X-Men Dark Phoenix is a total, unmitigated disaster of a film and is quite possibly the worst X-Men movie I have ever seen in my life. And yes, before you say anything else, I've seen every single X-Men movie up to this point. So, the plot of this movie, that is the concluding chapter of the X-Men franchise, is somewhat of a remake or redo of X-Men The Last Stand, in which it is trying to retell their own version of one of the famous comic runs in the X-Men franchise, the Dark Phoenix Saga, but somehow does it significantly worse. So what happens in Dark Phoenix is that it opens up in the 1990s, and everyone around the world loves the X-Men because of their heroic deeds to society. However, where things go terribly wrong is when, during a space mission, whereas Jean Grey, played by Sophie Turner, and the rest of the X-Men are trying to save some astronauts and their commander, Jean Grey unfortunately risks her life to save the other astronauts as well as consuming an extraterrestrial solar flare before she can make it back to the ship on time, appearing to almost die but instead wields a remarkable yet dangerous power that is beyond her own control, becoming the Dark Phoenix, or Phoenix if you will, even though she clearly revealed that power a movie ago in X-Men Apocalypse. And so Professor Xavier, Mystique, and the rest of the X-Men, still being played by James McAvoy again, and Jennifer Lawrence, looking like she completely gave zero making this, including Michael Fassbender once again as Magneto, to not only try to help her control her own powers, but to stop Jean Grey from causing such havoc since her powers also killed someone a part of their team, and to prevent her from certain harm that can cost not only the lives of the United States, but the entire world as a whole. And also, Jessica Chastain is in this movie for the most easiest paycheck imaginable, as a shape-shifting alien queen who wants to go to manipulate Jean Grey to giving her own powers away just so she can rule the universe. Right from the get-go of this movie, it is apparently clear that nobody gave a shit making this movie. No one. There was no heart, there was no passion, nothing. And it mostly has to do with one of the biggest reasons as to why Dark Phoenix is a terrible movie to begin with. This movie's directing and writing is barren and lifeless. Nothing about this movie's plot and directing felt inspired, well thought out, or something that is worth revealing to the big screen to begin with. Everything in this movie felt like it was going through the motions, and there was no sense of care or respect to anything that was going on. And seeing how this movie was suffering from delay upon delay while working on reshoots for one of the biggest acts of the movie, having it supposed to premiere in 2018, and then pushing it back to February of 2019, and then pushing it back to June of 2019, I can obviously see why the writing in this movie is so half-assed and lazy, because the movie not only seems to mishandle certain characters, but also drop interesting elements from movies entirely, especially from X-Men Apocalypse. And while X-Men Apocalypse in and of itself is a terrible movie to begin with, it did have some interesting aspects to spare, namely some of the aspects that have to deal with Magneto and Quicksilver. One of the moments that was somewhat teased or introduced in the movie is that Magneto, surprise surprise, is Quicksilver's dad. And Magneto has no idea of this. And then you have some scenes of Quicksilver trying to say to Magneto, hey, you're my dad, even though at the same time, he's just afraid to do so. And so I was thinking, okay, since X-Men Apocalypse kind of left off with a little bit intrigue into the mix, maybe X-Men Dark Phoenix can possibly bring this story back, right?
Wrong!
It gets dropped entirely from the movie. It never gets introduced again. Why? Why would you do that? It would have made something a little bit more interesting into the storyline. It wouldn't have made the story better, but hey, it would have brought in efficient character development. But instead, that side plot comes and goes nowhere. It's as if the directors and writers of the movie just completely forgot one of the most intriguing elements of X-Men Apocalypse and just said, screw it. Screw it. And speaking of wasted potential, there was a side plot in the movie that has to do with the alien race that is known as the Dabari that Jessica Chastain is also a part of. And that side plot just comes out of nowhere and isn't touched upon as well as you would expect, making them about as generic and non-threatening as the Dark Elves in Thor: The Dark World. Next up, let's talk about the unbelievably dull performances. And I'm telling you guys, there is not a single performance in this movie that is at least above passable. The vast majority of the cast, when it comes to Ty Sheridan as Cyclops, Nicholas Hoult as Beast, aka Hank McCoy, acts so stiff and non-passionate that it feels like everyone is there just for an obligation because of a contract or a big paycheck. But at the same time, seeing how most of those actors have been in superior work other than this, I feel sorry for every single one of them. Even Oscar-worthy actors like Michael Fassbender as Magneto and even Jessica Chastain look like they're eyeing the exit door the entire time. James McAvoy, who is mostly one of the biggest bright spots of the newer X-Men movies as Professor Xavier, looks completely defeated trying to make this dialogue even somewhat convincing, and especially for the main actress herself in the movie, Sophie Turner as Jean Grey. I understand entirely that she is talented and she does a very good job in Game of Thrones as Sansa Stark. And I feel sorry for her because not only does she have to deal with the worst season of Game of Thrones history in this film right here, which doesn't do any favors to her career at all, but I hate to be the one that says this, but Sophie Turner, unfortunately, is terrible in this movie. And I know that she is trying her best, trying to play this key role in the X-Men lore, but her line delivery is so plain and vapid, and her dialogue makes her look even worse. And speaking of which, if you thought Godzilla King of the Monsters dialogue was bad, you haven't seen this film's line delivery and dialogue yet. I have never, for the life of me, seen dialogue so poorly written, staged, and humiliating in any superhero film this decade, let alone a freaking X-Men movie. There is literally a line in this movie that comes out of Jessica Chastain's mouth as she's clearly telling Jean Grey, right before the allied X-Men are about to stop her, "You're not gonna let them stop you, you're gonna fight back." It's a line that is about as terrible as the lyricism in Electro's song in The Amazing Spider-Man 2, as it's actively trying to say aloud what the character is supposed to be feeling. And let's not forget about the humdinger that comes out of Jennifer Lawrence's mouth. There was a clip online, you can easily see this on YouTube, in which Jennifer Lawrence is talking to Professor Xavier about, "Last time I checked, the women are doing the most saving around here. You might as well call it X-Women instead of X-Men." And while that line is absolute cringeworthy to the max, it also made me think of something. Why is the X-Men all about gender all of a sudden? I thought that the main goal of the X-Men was that everyone takes their part in working together and saving the world and using their gifts for the greater good. And it really didn't matter on who you are and what you look like. Regardless, he gave me the opportunity to say this. Congratulations, Halle Berry and Juggernaut. You no longer have the worst lines in X-Men history. Also, the visual effects in this movie are absolutely dreadful. It may come as no surprise to some people seeing how the visual effects in the X-Men movies aren't really known for being state-of-the-art special effects or holding up to this day even in the slightest. However, there are some visual effects like in X-Men Days of Future Past that absolutely hold up and look utterly fantastic. But with X-Men Dark Phoenix, this is a whole new low when it comes to the visual effects department of this franchise. In fact, most of it looks noticeably cheap and unfinished to the point where you can't even find it even more convincing if it appeared on a superhero show on the CW network. The solar flare powers and even the solar flare itself when it's coming right at Jean Grey looks like the leftover special effects of Green Lantern's version of Parallax. And we'll get to the action scenes in a bit, but do you remember when Magneto was lifting up that huge baseball stadium in X-Men Days of Future Past? Or when he absolutely demolished Auschwitz in X-Men Apocalypse? Or when he's holding up dozens of rockets and shooting it at the US and Russian convoys in X-Men First Class? Those were very cool moments, but here, the visual effects for this powers aren't as great as they once were, because there is a scene where Magneto is holding dozens upon dozens of weapons shooting at one of the aliens. And the guns that are levitating and shooting and dropping once they ran out of ammunition looked so noticeably terrible that it rivals Wolverine's claws in X-Men Origins Wolverine. And speaking of action sequences in this movie, while you were hoping that they may somewhat not make this movie suck any worse, all three of these action scenes are tireless slogs to get through. And the writing of the conflicts between the characters that not only get them to this exact point in the story, but are carried on throughout the film, are merely petty squabbles just for the sake of conflict. In one of the biggest action scenes in this movie, the rest of the X-Men, along with Magneto's allies, are fighting in the middle of the night and in the middle of the street where there's people around, and the reasoning behind doing so is something that is so incredibly petty and impossible to care about that by the time the action sequence finished, you go, well, what the hell was the point of that action sequence? They could have handled everything in a debate or a solid conversation instead of risking the lives of several innocent people just because one of the original members of the X-Men passed away. In fact, most of these characters' conflicts is passion over logic and nothing more. Most of the conflict is them fighting over nothing. They basically fight over the worst possible things to argue about, not to mention that the final action sequences in this movie, one that has to do with the train, and even the conflict between the alien queen and Jean Grey is a predictable catastrophe, in which you know exactly how things are gonna play out without any sort of suspense whatsoever, which is kind of a big problem that set itself apart from the other X-Men films. Where's the suspense? Where's the dread? Where's the emotion that makes you feel like, whoa, this is getting to this point, we gotta settle up for a final battle. Instead, everything just feels small and safe. Is there any other positives I can say about this movie? Okay, there is one scene that has to do with Magneto using his powers on that train sequence that, while it is being bloated, there is one time where Magneto does become a badass for about a minute or so. And then we get back to the boring storyline. And also one of the saving graces being that it makes you want to watch Logan again, which is never a bad thing. But other than that, there is nothing that makes Dark Phoenix worthwhile. At least X-Men The Last Stand felt like it was building up to something better. At least X-Men Origins Wolverine was trying. In Dark Phoenix, no one was trying, and it felt like it was a pathetic obligation to create rather than a concluding chapter. I feel sorry for every single writer, every single actor, and every single production or visual effects artist that worked on this movie, because this is not what they deserve at all. The directing and the writing are barren. The acting is unbelievably dull. The dialogue is god-awful. The visual effects are egregiously half-assed. And the action sequences and the entire payoff are tireless slogs to get through and end the franchise with a predictable and piss-poor resolution. 20th Century Fox should be ashamed of themselves for creating something so suckingly horrible with no care or respect for the audiences, the fans, and even themselves. If you don't care about your movie, I don't care about your movie. And that is why Dark Phoenix for me gets a 0 out of 5. Oh, and by the way, 20th Century Fox, good luck with New Mutants if it ever comes out, because you're gonna need it. Alright guys, so that is my review of X-Men Dark Phoenix. Comment below, let me know what you thought about the movie. Find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, and also if you would like to see more reviews or rants like this, be sure to subscribe for more. My name is Luke Nukem, and 20th Century Fox, the fans, the audiences, and the entire franchise deserved better than this.